with a very, very recent autobiographical story following the last question. In July of this year, a conference of Eranos was supposed to take place in a very famous monastery, Niamets. Everything was organized and finalized. In the last moment, they understood that someone is going to speak about Kabbalah. And they canceled it. The Niamets monastery, meaning the stronghold of Neo-Hesychas, which were not aware they could make a lot of money out of the conference. They canceled the conference. It was moved elsewhere. But that's an example of the tensions, incredible tensions, which I would like not to go on with this incident, which is very, very interesting, what happened afterwards. But that's indeed now what's going on in Romania today, which I'm not going to speak at all. It's a huge revival of interest in Kabbalah, Theosophy, Freemasonry, very, very open, unparalleled in my opinion in other places. Okay, so that's not before the introduction. So I'm going to speak here about what happened in the first part of the 20th century in Bucharest, basically. But I shall try to introduce what's going to happen in that period by giving some examples of the interest in Kabbalah beforehand. Romania is geographically found between empires, always. So the Ottoman Empire, with a lot of Jews interested in Kabbalah, was very present in Bucharest, which was actually under the Ottoman Empire and still in the 19th century. On the north was Russia and Poland, with a lot of interest in Kabbalah and Hasidism among Jews, and not only. However, what I'm going to deal here is not with the Ottoman Jews or interest in the Russian or Slavic, but with the third center of culture, and that's the French one, which had an impact on the Romanian elite even stronger than on the Jews. So the interest in Kabbalah and Theosophy started relatively early, as early as early 18th century, when one of the most learned, if not the most learned, Romanian thinker and some form of prince, Dimitri Cantemir, wrote a commentary on Van Helmont's discussions of Sefer Yetzirah in Latin. I don't know if that's the reason why he was accepted in the Bavarian Academy by Leibniz, which is quite fitting for someone interested in Van Helmont to be accepted by Leibniz in the Academy. However, in the 19th century, mid-19th century, you can find in Bucharest a full-fledged Kabbalist writing maybe the most important Kabbalistic writing in the 19th century in general. A Kabbalist not very well known, Yaakov Shpilman, who wrote several Kabbalistic books, but the most important one is the interesting compendium of Luriani Kabbalah Tyler wrote, not studied. He wrote also some studies which are still in manuscripts. However, for our point, what is even more interesting is the fact that in 1898, a certain figure was invited from Paris to give a series of lectures named Josephine Paladin. Invited to Bucharest to give a series of lectures, and he delivered a series of lectures which culminated in a scandalon that had to escape in order not to be arrested. So those tensions are quite obvious in 1898 when Paladin is coming there with his theories, attempting to convince the Romanian to convert to Catholicism, not to his theosophy, to Catholicism, as part of a vision, more general vision of the Latin genius. That is his basic idea. It was not well received by the Orthodox Church, and he had to escape. But he was invited by a Romanian was in Paris and was well acquainted with the Theosophy going on in Paris, a scandalous figure by any standard, who is now forgotten, but his invitation of Peladan is an example of a real interest. Had to pay a lot of money for him to come and deliver the lectures in the most, how to put it, elite places in Bucharest. So there was an interest, either by writing full-fledged books, which I cannot enter now, about Kabbalah in Bucharest. Those are just some few examples. But I'm concerned here on more specific issues that will culminate, in my opinion, with the penetration of Kabbalistic and Theosophical ideas in the writings which were more widespread than any of the figures you mentioned here. And toward the end, I hope to show that, in fact, some directions, starting in the 20s in Bucharest, penetrated a figure who disseminated them widely in the second part of the 20th century. So let me start with a figure, for sure you didn't hear about him, but unfortunately he was well known in Romania for some 20 years, and that is the head, or the ideologue, of the most extreme ultranationalist, fascist, archi-anti-Semitic party, named Ionescu, professor of philosophy at the University of Bucharest, who, bizarrely enough, had a deep interest in Kabbalah, and he helped a lot of Jews in the first part of his career. He started his career by writing a PhD thesis in München. He finished it in 1919 with a professor named Clemens Baumker. Someone remembers the name? Very important name in the history of Kabbalah. He was actually the doctor father of Sholem. But Sholem arrives there only some few months later, after Ionescu finished his PhD. But Baumker was interested in Kabbalah. If you're going to have a look in his writings, you're going to see that he's quoting, even in Hebrew, with many, many mistakes. But he's quoting not Kabbalistic texts, but at least Kabbalistic sentences. However, Ionescu didn't write about Kabbalah, he wrote about logic. Not so obvious if he finished a PhD or not, that's still a controversy, but he became the leading professor of philosophy in Bucharest and the leading intellectual in Romania and the leading avant-garde figure. However, he was interested in Kabbalah, and according to his student, Moshe IDEL, I'm quoting here, what he wrote about his master, about the intentions of his master in 1927-28, I quote, Ionescu, one who studied Kabbalah and Jewish mystics, who has said, he's quoting now Ionescu, I have been tempted many times to give up journalism as well as politics. He was very powerful in politics, and concentrate myself to Jewish studies. It's a pity he didn't do it. Now, what is the Jewish studies? Jewish studies, basically Kabbalah. I shall bring some few examples, but there are more. So, this Ionescu, for sure he knows the rudimentaries of Kabbalah, Adam Kadmon, and using them in his lectures of philosophy at the University of Bucharest. But he had, I would like to discuss two examples. He's speaking about Kabbalah and Theosophy, putting them together in a certain context, which is interesting. In one of them, he's saying, for example, in just the period he's already changing his mind. I quote, in order that results will be obtained, it's necessary that at the same time this anti-Masonic struggle should be fought against liberal individualists, scientists, Cartesian and Kantianism, against democracy, against constitutional monarchy, against republicanism, against socialism, etc., against Kabbalah, against Theosophy, against Asian pantheism, against humanism. So you can see a program where Theosophy and Kabbalah are part of an Asian vision which invaded Europe together with humanism, etc. And that should be fought. And that the same attitude is found in another context of UNESCO, meaning he didn't write too much, he almost didn't write anything. So, not so sure he wrote a PhD, but for sure he didn't write anything in Bucharest about journalist stories. But he's quoted by his students, for example, as saying that someone should prevent Buddha, Greece, Kabbalah, and other Asiatic forms of Jewish esotericism. That's a very interesting observation. Asiatic forms of Jewish esotericism, up to Spinoza. He's seeing a long tradition, starting from Greece, via Kabbalah, via Asiatic forms of Jewish esotericism, and so on. So it's quite obvious that he has a certain vision. Very interesting is a statement which is a little bit cryptic, but very interesting historically. What he's writing as follows: emerging from where it emerged, Theosophy arrived where it arrived, to Judaism. And he's looking to Theosophy as a purely Jewish story which started in Judaism and returned to Judaism. So, given the fact that he refused to write, he believes the writing is petrifying. He gave lectures all the time with thousands of people coming there, and many of them took notes, and the notes were published, and that's why we don't have a real system. But it's quite obvious that he had the vision of mentioning Madame Blavatsky in India and the Hindu Kabbalah, meaning it's quite obvious for him that a certain Asian invasion of phenomena that are detrimental for a normal Romania. Now, the interest in Kabbalah was very powerful in his circle, meaning he had a circle of intellectuals, the most important one in Romania in this period. And this circle, we can find testimonies about what people were reading. For example, Zen in the 30s, a leading Romanian poet, Vasile Voiculescu, is writing as follows: I knew Kabbalah from studies, especially from those of Adolf Frank, from Carter. I read the book, Sefer Yetzirah, with its commentaries. I practiced the Rosicrucians of Peladan. I inquired the illuminism of the unknown philosopher. I remained for a long time in Theosophy, from Gnosis to Pistis Sophia, through Fabre de Olivet, Saint-Yvette d'Alberin, Eliphas Levin, Papus, up to modern Schure, Steiner, Blavatsky, Annie Besant, and others. So that was actually the library of young intellectuals in the 20s and 30s in Europe, and in the most powerful and influential circle, Zen. Another example from this circle, not exactly part and parcel of it, but very close to it, is a Jew who converted to Christianity, named Mordechai Marcel Michail, that's different stages of his development, Avramescu, who became a leading figure in Romanian spiritualism up to the 70s. But he started in the 30s, his interest in Guénon, especially in Guénon. He published actually a Guénonian journal named Memra, with a lot of material coming from whatever sources of esotericism and theosophy. Unfortunately, he published only 2 issues, and we can see a rather vivid interest in it. Given the fact he was very young, very poor, he couldn't sustain the interest in such a journal, but the content should still be analyzed, because one of the major contributors to this journal was Moshe IDEL. So let me turn now to Eliade, who was part and parcel of this circle, the most prominent actual exponent of what happened in this circle. Eliade started his interest in Kabbalah before he became the disciple of INASWE. Already in his high school, he studied Kabbalistic books in French. We know at least some of them, for sure, he's quoting them. And he had a very positive attitude toward Kabbalah. Meaning for him, Kabbalah, especially the book of the Zohar, it's a very ancient book, a book of magic. That's the way that's for him something very, very positive. It's very important to emphasize. That's a very positive attribute, the book of magic. He believed in magic all his life. And from this point of view, that is a positive statement. And in a controversy he had with a colleague in high school, a Jewish figure, he defended the Zohar against his Jewish colleague. So he read, actually, he started to study a little bit Hebrew, but that didn't help him too much. He read in French. What he read in French actually had a deep impact on him. He read it before he left the high school. In the second part of the 20s, he was born in 1907, second part of the 20s, you can find a lot of Kabbalah in his writings. Almost everything going back to the most important book for him, La Kabbalah Juive of Paul Voliot, who is quoted several times in his book, and in my opinion, that's a deep impact on his vision of religion. In 29, 30, 31, he was in India. So he had the opportunity also to learn a little bit about Hindu culture, but also about Theosophy. When returning to Romania in 1932, his visions can be described as a hybridic or synthetic vision between earlier interest in Kabbalah and the Hindu philosophy that he studied with Dasgupta in India. However, his interest in Kabbalah remained very, very clear, even in the period when he became closer to UNESCO and member of the Iron Club. Didn't deter him to quote Kabbalistic statements at all. And this practice continued up to 1947. Since 1947, you can see Kabbalah disappears from his writings, which became actually the most influential descriptions of religion in the 20th century. However, the ideas he adopted from Kabbalah didn't disappear. What disappeared was a reference to the Kabbalistic sources. But that can be easily shown. I have done this exercise elsewhere, that the same ideas are found, but now he removed the Kabbalistic reference, put other reference there, but without changing actually the content. So, at the beginning it was a wonder, why would someone do something like that after the Second World War? Even more, given the fact that he could show that he had an interest, a positive interest in Judaism, unlike UNESCO. And the solution is relatively simple. He entered the circle of Eranos, and there was Sholem. And he didn't dare to speak about Volio in the presence of Sholem, after Sholem wrote the devastating review of Volio's book that he published, and apparently Eliade read it. So he decided actually to retreat from this interest in Kabbalah in an open way, while not changing his interest. So what happened is that 47, 48 is a turning point from the point of view of his reference to Kabbalah, but not from the point of view of his still adhering to the ideas that he took from the Kabbalistic sources, which were actually deviated and influenced by Christian Kabbalah, that is Volio, that's not exactly the book of Zohar, but Eliade believes that what he is writing about is something universal, and Kabbalah is very, very ancient, meaning for him, very ancient means from Assyria, something really very ancient, although the Kabbalists will say. But the interest in Kabbalah remained rather powerful in Bucharest during the Second World War. I was able to detect a circle of, I would say, high dignitary figures during the World War, including ministers, generals, mayors of Bucharest, 2 mayors of Bucharest, advocates studying Kabbalah with a Jewish Kabbalist. We have at least 2 manuscripts written in 1942 and 1944, which can give us an idea what was Kabbalah in this circle in Bucharest. We have 2 manuscripts which survived in Romanian, which were for sure delivered in this circle by the leader of this circle, a Kabbalist unknown, which I invented, named Menachem Mendel Stein, in Romania, Immanuel Stein. So he taught this circle, which helped him to survive the Second World War. There's a big family in conditions which were very, very difficult, but you cannot imagine generals were coming there to a small apartment in Bucharest and paying a lot of money. I still spoke with the children of this guy who is describing people coming with money in order to study Kabbalah. For a while, this guy was detained in a camp. And he continued to teach from the camp by correspondence, meaning he was delivering his lectures by correspondence, and the secretaries were coming to the family and paying for one of the letters they received from the camp. So, what is interesting in the writings of this Immanuel Stein is an attempt to offer a synthesis between someone who knew Kabbalah in original, meaning he knew very well Kabbalah, and he translated Kabbalistic texts in Romanian, but he was, I have to call it, open-minded. He was interpreting Kabbalah according to whatever was on the market, like many other people today. Meaning physiognomy, for example, whatever type of philosophy that he could read, he read Romanian well enough. And in one of the, he wrote the 2 books in 42, 44, but he continued to write additional notes on the margin. What is interesting that in one of those Ren notes, he's attempting to explain a terrible event that happened in the 30s, the late 30s in Romania, when some almost 100 children were burned alive in the church. So that was something totally, how to incomprehensible. He's attempting to describe the reasons why it happened, as he's doing with a lot of events in that period. That's why people were coming there, to understand Kabbalistically what happens around. So his explanation is, and that was interesting in this explanation, he didn't want to offer apparently his own vision and his own name. So he's saying, I spoke with Theosophists. I don't know if there were Theosophists in Bucharest then or not, but he is referring to Theosophists who told me that those children are actually the transmigration of the souls of Catholics who burned Huguenots in the 16th century. So I don't know who those Theosophists are. My impression is that he is this Theosophist because he's using actually the idea of transmigration, the Kabbalistic vision of transmigration, in a very clear way. But at least he's attributing this reading to people alive. He's speaking about living people that he's discussed it could not be before it happened. And that is what he was teaching his disciples. Some of them were killed because they were high dignitaries during the Second World War. They were killed after the end of the war. But it is very bizarre to see to what extent Kabbalistic ideas attracted a range of Romanian intellectuals, from the most important philosopher, Ionescu, up to mayors of Bucharest who attended those lectures. But more important, in my opinion, is the impact on Eliade, which adopted interpretations of Kabbalah stemming from Christian circles without being aware that it's a Christian interpretation of Kabbalah, because he believes that it's Kabbalah, simply Kabbalah, and introduced it in actually in his books where Kabbalah is no more mentioned. Interestingly enough, if you're going to read the Encyclopedia of Eliade, published in post-mortem in 1987, you're going to see that he returns to Kabbalah very openly in what he wrote. It was 5 years after the death of Sholem. He could afford himself, once again, to write about Kabbalah, despite the fact that he interrupted his interest in 1947. In my opinion, Kabbalah was more important than ideas that he took from Kabbalah. Given the fact that he wrote his MA thesis on the Renaissance in 1927-28 in Italy, he studied Piccola Mirandola and Ficino, and he was inspired by the synthesis made especially by Pico between Hermeticism and Kabbalah. So that's what he called the first Renaissance. What he attempted to do, according to his own view, this is not my reading, to offer a second Renaissance, meaning a synthesis, and he's speaking about his enterprise in terms parallel to Pico's appropriation of Kabbalah. What he attempted to offer is a vision of Kabbalah that is a synthesis between the European culture and the Eastern culture, the Hindu culture. That's the way in which, in my opinion, he attempted to reform modern religion, Western modern religion, by returning to the synthetic approach found in Pico, and he believed that could actually reinvigorate the status of religion in the West. If my conjecture that Eliade took the idea of the synthesis as the leading criterion for a new form of religiosity from the Renaissance Kabbalah, the influence of Kabbalistic views is greater than the details, which are interesting enough, but they are not always mentioned appropriately in his writings known in the West. So that is, how to put it, some points which can be elaborated a lot in order to show that the most influential figure in the history of religion in the 20th century not only was acquainted with or quoted Kabbalistic writings, but he absorbed Kabbalistic ideas, diluted, as I mentioned, despite the fact he attempted to study Hebrew, and incorporated them in his more general vision of religion in a way that escaped the scrutiny of even scholars of Jewish mysticism, who are surprised by the pertinence of Eliade to Kabbalah without being aware that indeed Kabbalah is the source of his visions. That is one of the ironies of history, that someone like Eliade could have an impact on the study of Kabbalah because he adopted and then removed the references to Kabbalah and gave the impression that his own, how to put it, theory of religion. Theosophy here is part and parcel of the story that we can see not only in his friend Voiculescu, that I mentioned earlier, with all of this list. A very similar list is found also in one of the novels of Eliade, which he never finished. But there, the main figure describing his library. His library have the same books that I mentioned earlier from his friend. Meaning Theosophy, together with Kabbalah, was part and parcel of what happened in Bucharest. But with one or two exceptions, no one was able to offer a synthesis, what Eliade called an universalistic synthesis, where Kabbalah has a significant role. So, to what extent he was acquainted with Kabbalah, with Theosophy in India is still a matter to be investigated. He is not mentioning in his journals meetings with Theosophists, but at least from the list of UNESCO, where he's speaking about Kabbalah and Asian Theosophy, Asian Esotericism, my impression is that that was the leading idea also in his circle. Let me finish with a recent finding of something old. In 1942, in a journal of general philosophy in Bucharest, an article was published named The Philosophy of Kabbalah. We're speaking about 1942. I don't know who this guy is, George Bumbesh. He described Kabbalah, that's the main topic, as the quintessence of the Asian spirit versus the Western spirit, like now UNESCO. He didn't dare to mention now UNESCO because then, 1942, UNESCO was actually, couldn't be mentioned. But we have exactly the same ideas we found earlier. In UNESCO, the Asian spirit doesn't fit the European spirit, Hegelian Kantian spirit. And the philosophy of Kabbalah, interestingly enough, that's a very interesting observation I had, has a vision of ontology that can be corrupted. What I read in Uriani Kabbalah, in theology, the possibility is that divinity can be corrupted, can be diminished. That's what he doesn't like. That's the Asian spirit. Versus the Hegelian one that he is praising. So that's very bizarre that in those times, where anti-Semitism was on the peak, pogroms in Bucharest, people were coming to study Kabbalah and writing articles about the philosophy of Kabbalah without being aware that actually they contribute in one way or another with this form of criticism. What happens immediately around them? We're thinking about people who are part of the Romanian government coming to study Kabbalah. For reasons I can explain, but it's going to take too much. Why those people came there? Because this Immanuel Stein was interpreting actual events according to Kabbalistic principles. They came there not to study Kabbalah per se, but to study how to interpret political events which are found in those manuscripts according to principles of Kabbalah. So we can find influences of Kabbalah, including mentioning of Theosophy, but for them Theosophy and Kabbalah are the same. Even in very bizarre conjunctures in history, by people who contributed rather greatly to what happened during the Second World War. So the history of Kabbalah has its bizarre moments, which are even more bizarre than you can imagine. So I couldn't imagine ever that now UNESCO was intending to become a scholar of Kabbalah. There are more than one evidence, not only Eliade, also others are mentioning that that's what he intended, and unfortunately he didn't do it. So Clemens Baumker could have two students of Kabbalah, one Scholem and one UNESCO. Unfortunately he remained with only one. Thank you very much.
Take a couple of minutes for questions. Just a quick chair prerogative. Common question. What? It's okay. Should we be? It seems to me that the idea of framing Kabbalah as Asiatic would be typical, really, until maybe the 1950s or something, when people started for the first time thinking about Jews as Western or white. And I wonder if it only surprises us now to hear Kabbalah framed as an Asiatic doctrine because we're looking at it anachronistically from the perspective of people who take it for granted that Jews are Western, white people. That's one little comment. And the other was just whether you could say, very briefly, an example of an Eliade doctrine that has roots in his interest in Kabbalah. Just the Sabirat Ozen.
First, the first part of Asian, I believe that they were acquainted, they were reading Blavatsky, coming from India. So he connoted a vision that is Kabbalah is coming from the East. And also the Kabbalists was there. Right. And Blavatsky and all the others would say, okay, the whole story which you don't like is Asian. So the Jews are also coming from there. So that's no great problem to assume that the whole story of what is bad is coming from the East, unlike late 18th century, 19th century when the looks, ex-Oriente looks, now ex-Oriente tenebre. The second question was what about Eliade?
Just a little example of an Eliade doctrine that has roots in this Kabbalistic
a leading example. Found already in Peredan. but Eliade took it from Bourdieu, is like the importance of androgyny as an ideal.
Okay.
So that you can find in Eliade's book, Mephistopheles et l'androgyne, which was written basically in the 30s, with references on the Zohar, and telling you how the Zohar is speaking about it. And if you're going to read the lecture, he delivered it in Athenaeus. There's no Zohar. So that's the idea of the androgyne as the idea, as the major idea, but there are more. So that you can find in Pelada, you can find in Bourdieu, who took it from other sources. That's less important now. Eliade adopted it and wrote about it many, many, many times, including in his Encyclopedia of Religion, where he wrote the item to see, he was very old when writing, he didn't write so many items. So there you can find again, it's found in the Zohar. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Marco.
I found, well, the whole paper fascinating, and even more fascinating this point about Eliade stopping making references to Kabbalah after the Second World War. Because actually I hadn't noticed, but it's absolutely correct. And on the other hand, I was wondering, because most of the work, or a lot of the work that Eliade does after the war is actually comparative in nature. So what he could have done was just, which means that he was not in the necessity of presenting himself as the utmost specialist of Kabbalah. So what he could have done, and which he does in fact for other religious traditions, would be just quoting from the best specialists around on that given field, which would be, in this case, of course, Scholem himself. And of course, he knew very well Scholem's publications and books and so on. Well, they were in contact also, and he was going to Eranos, and well, at least he was listening to the lectures of Scholem in Eranos.
After 1947, 48, up to Eliade 1980, 81, 82. No Scholem.
Yes, but he was not referring to him.
That's true. That is the quandary. The quandary is not that he didn't know Scholem. Not that he didn't have the articles of Scholem in the Eranos Yearbook, published exactly with his articles. He didn't read them. You don't believe. No. So, okay. So let me give you what Eliade is saying. In 1986, no, 1966, 7, 5 essays of Scholem from Eranos were translated in English under the title On the Kabbalah and Its Symbolism. Everything Eranos. Shokin asked Eliade to write a blurb. Eliade wrote a very nice blurb. Have a look in his journal in 1985. He's writing, I am reading Scholem's articles. Extraordinary. I never heard about those issues.
Never heard about?
I never heard about those issues. He didn't pay attention that it was given at Eranos.
But he was reading them at that moment.
Oh, in 85, in order to write, 66,
no,
in order to write the blurb. But when he wrote the blurb, no, I can quote you more. He's saying, I'm reading it very, very fast. Very fast. Extraordinary. I shall return to them, which means he didn't read them.
That's 1 year before he died, actually. But the question was it not also because he had a bad consciousness about what he was involved in and what he did before the war? I mean, is it just because he was afraid of quoting Bourdieu, or is there something deeper psychologically that is going on?
In my opinion, the answer is more complex. And the answer is as follows. Bourdieu was part of a wider phenomenon called Esotericism. And Eliade attempted to escape the categorization of his views as esoteric. So it's not only Sholem, that's a more complex story. So he still believed in Bolio. He visited in 1952 the house of Bolio. But he couldn't mention them too much because that will include him into a category he wanted to escape. Not, Philosophia perennis, again, with all this stuff, with Ebola, with Guénon. He wanted to escape. However, in the correspondence he has, unfortunately, the letter of Eliade disappeared, but we have the answer of Ebola. He's saying, maybe you're the Trojan horse in the academy. You didn't want to be identified with this form of esoteric, limited vision. He wanted to have the universalistic vision. And that's another reason why he didn't want to go to Bolio, because he didn't know too much beyond Bolio.
Because of the late hour.